皆さん、こんにちは。ごめんなさい、私は英語で話します。でも心には日本語です。I have called this lecture a personal journey because in the area of interfaith dialogue, I consider myself a practitioner rather than an academic scholar of the subject. Moreover, I wanted to include a little of my own personal experience of the last 40 years, because the personal may help bridge the gap between the very different cultural and historical backgrounds of a European Jew and a Japanese audience. In fact, I am currently in the strange position of finding myself the subject of a chapter in a doctoral dissertation from the University of Cologne. It is devoted to a particular series of interfaith conferences, Jewish-Christian and Jewish-Christian-Muslim, that I helped found and organize some 40 years ago. The dissertation explored the theological basis for engaging in interfaith dialogue as reflected in these particular conferences. Today in Western Europe, interfaith dialogue in various forms is an area of growing interest and investment at personal, academic, and governmental levels. European countries have become places of immigration, in part as the legacy of empire, in part as desirable places for refugees from areas of ethnic or religious intolerance and conflict, or of extreme poverty. Moreover, these European countries in the past viewed themselves as having a homogeneous population and as being Christian in their religious orientation, perhaps with a small minority of non-conformist groups, such as the Jews. However, recent decades have seen a growth in particular of sizable Muslim communities from North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, often viewed with anxiety by the host nation. A second factor encouraging the trend towards intercultural and interfaith dialogue is the increasing secularization of Western European societies, though one must be careful how we understand the term secularization. Part of the problem is the disenchantment with classical forms of religious belief and authority. People feel estranged from the traditional festival calendar or life cycle rituals, but may nevertheless seek alternative sources of spiritual nourishment. As a consequence, the classical religious communities have lost such power as they once held over their own adherents, and in the case of Christianity, their political power and authority within society as a whole. In such an environment, there is a growing attraction for religious communities to seek partners within other faith communities who find themselves in a similar situation. This trend may then be rationalized as a logical extension of certain universalistic impulses within the traditional faith itself. That is to say, on the practical and even political level, religious individuals and faith communities find themselves meeting and even joining together in common projects, such as to combat racism or to address environmental issues. However, the theological justification for such encounters tends to remain the domain of professional theologians or clergy, with relatively little of the new thinking filtering down to the grassroots, though even this is changing. To introduce something of my own biography, I grew up in the Jewish community of London. The Jewish population in the United Kingdom is now about 280,000. In some ways, my upbringing was typical of a common pattern that emerged in the 20th century. Jews emigrated in massive numbers from Tsarist Russia at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, escaping from discrimination, persecution, and pogroms. My family ended up in England. I was born in 1942 and grew up in South London with all the advantages of a British public school education and the assumption that, like my father, my 3 uncles, and a cousin, I would become a medical doctor. My Jewish life and education began in an Orthodox Jewish synagogue in South London, most of whose members were not really Orthodox, either in their belief or their religious practice. They reflected the long-term effects on Judaism of the European emancipation. The Jewish communities of the Middle Ages were closed, self-regulating societies collectively subject to the government of the region or country where they were located. With the emancipation, over time, Jews became instead individual members of Western society, increasingly more free to choose whether or to what extent they wished to remain bound to the Jewish community and tradition. Jewish law, which had previously regulated every aspect of Jewish life, communal as well as spiritual, in a closed society, now became something which one was free to adhere to or abandon. The family and emotional ties of Jewish religious life remained, but by the time I was growing up, the breakdown of the authority of the tradition resulted in a whole range of individual compromises. For example, we would go to synagogue on the Shabbat, but we would travel by car, though driving on Shabbat was forbidden by Jewish law, as it constituted a form of work. Like many others, however, we would park the car around the corner from the synagogue, out of sight, as a sign of public respect for the institution, though no one was fooled by our doing so. Many Jews simply lived with these kinds of contradictions, but nevertheless retained a formal loyalty to the Orthodox framework. But already in the 19th century, a number of movements, variously labeled as reform, liberal, or progressive, beginning in Germany but developing especially in the democratic climate of North America, began to emerge. They saw themselves as trying to preserve the best of the religious tradition while adopting the best of contemporary values from their surrounding society. These tendencies, alongside more secular ones like Zionism and different varieties of socialism, became areas of internal conflict within the Jewish world and remain divisive until today. Of course, this picture is further complicated by the horrors of the Holocaust, which, among other things, destroyed the great traditional Orthodox centers of Jewish life in Eastern Europe, but also severely undermined the universalistic hopes and intellectual optimism of the progressive Jewish movements of Western Europe and the United States. The other great change in Jewish self-understanding today is the result of the creation of the State of Israel. It has restored some of the sense of lost identity and hope caused by the Holocaust through emphasizing the national element in Jewish life. My personal response to these contradictions and tensions was to abandon the synagogue immediately after my bar mitzvah at the age of 13, sensing in our highly selective ritual behavior at home only a kind of hypocrisy. My return to some kind of Jewish consciousness came through membership of the youth group of a Reform synagogue, and some years later I made the decision to study for the rabbinate, to become a rabbi, at the Leo Baeck College in London. If we try to trace the origins of the modern rapprochement between Jews and Christians, a starting point would be a number of scholars in the late 19th and early 20th century. On the Jewish side, leading figures like Abraham Geiger, Hermann Cohen, Franz Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, and Claude Montefiore either studied the historical background to the Gospels or sought a theological understanding of the existence of Christianity from a Jewish perspective. From the Christian side, a number of major scholars, Léon Blois, Henry Danby, Robert Travers Herford, Jacques Maritain, George Foot Moore, began to study Jewish sources in the Mishnah, Midrash, and Talmud, and to seek to correct Christian misunderstandings and misrepresentations of these central texts of Judaism. The recognition of the dangers inherent in anti-Semitism and its background in Christian anti-Jewish teachings led to the emergence of jointly sponsored organizations to confront these attitudes in America and in Europe in the years immediately before World War II. However, the rise of Nazism and the persecution of the Jewish population of Germany, leading to the horrors of the Holocaust, helped establish organizations intended to combat religious prejudice and racism, which would subsequently develop into those fostering interfaith dialogue. In 1942, William Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury, convened a meeting that led to the establishment of the Council of Christians and Jews in the United Kingdom. war, when the true extent of the Holocaust was recognized, Christians were confronted with deep theological questions about the extent to which Christian teachings had laid the ground for what had happened. In 1947, an emergency conference on anti-Semitism in Seligsberg, Germany, led to the establishment of the International Council of Christians and Jews. It formulated 10 points which were addressed to the churches. 4 established the roots of Christianity in Judaism. 6 emphasized that the church should no longer present Judaism in a negative way. In Amsterdam in 1948, the General Assembly of the World Council of Churches called upon all the churches to denounce anti-Semitism as absolutely irreconcilable with the Christian faith. Understandably, after the war, the German churches found themselves having completely to re-examine and re-evaluate the role of the church during the Nazi period, and particularly with regards to the persecution of the Jews. Already in 1945, the first tentative documents began to emerge, acknowledging responsibility at first for the suffering of those nations attacked by Germany. The Wort zur Judenfrage, a statement on the Jewish question from the Bruderrat of the German Protestant Church in 1948, was the first German document after the Holocaust that began to make theological statements about Judaism. From the Roman Catholic Church, the decree Nostra Aetate, produced by the Second Vatican Council in October 1965, reflecting the personal concerns of Pope John XXIII, was a major step forward in Catholic-Jewish relations, particularly in its renouncing of the charge of deicide against the Jewish people. These and many subsequent church documents began to be written in consultation with Jewish representatives, opening up new dimensions that now fall broadly under the term dialogue. However, the theory of dialogue itself can be traced back to the writings of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, who wrote in 1929. The words of Martin Buber, "A time of genuine religious conversations is beginning, not those so-called but fictitious conversations in which none regarded and addressed his partner in reality, but genuine dialogues, speech from certainty to certainty, but also from one open-hearted person to another open-hearted person." This change from theoretical pronouncements by one religion about its interpretation of the other to a mutually shared understanding built upon the personal encounter between people of different faiths is what defines the new dimension of interfaith dialogue. My engagement with interfaith dialogue began in the 60s as a consequence of a visit to the Jewish community in Berlin. To cut a long story short, this led to encounters with a number of German pastors and eventually to a Catholic conference center called the Hedwig Dransfeld House in a little town called Bendorf on the Rhine in Germany. It had been founded by a Catholic women's movement and after the war was directed by a remarkable woman called Anneliese de Bray. She had set about making the center into a place of reconciliation, arranging conferences where German and French and German and Polish families lived together for a fortnight. Her wish to meet European Jews to take part in a conference between Israeli and German young people led to my visiting the center and an immediate rapport with this remarkable woman. The result was the transformation of the house's annual Catholic Bible Conference into a Jewish-Christian Bible Week. Over 40 years later, it remains unique in many ways. The post-war German Jewish community was very small, and such dialogue programs as existed meant that a Jewish speaker would visit, give a lecture, and leave. Here, for the first time, we spent a week living together, studying Bible texts and participating in each other's services, though it took many years of experimenting for the full pattern of the program to emerge. In effect, for the duration of the week, we created an interfaith community made more real by the presence of families with children. Looking back on the beginnings of the week at the 40th anniversary celebration, I spoke about the three dimensions I felt were present and whose relative significance changed over the years. There was the Jewish-Christian encounter that made the Bible Week possible and probably necessary as well, as Christians tried to come to terms with what was seen as a disastrous failure of the church during the Nazi period. There was the Jewish-German encounter, highly problematic and at times deeply painful, as we, Jews and Christians alike, became witness to a deeply felt sense of shame and guilt. And thirdly, there was the Hebrew Bible itself, the official catalyst, and through its treasures of stories and the richness of shared Jewish and Christian interpretations, an open door to any number of steps to understanding. The details of the evolution of the Bible Week would require a full lecture, but I want to introduce another encounter that was to affect my own subsequent development. My teacher and colleague, Rabbi Lionel Blue, was the initiator of a new dimension. He had come to know Winfried Mechler, a German pastor, who was then working in London at the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Church. A disciple of Bonhoeffer, Winfried belonged to the Confessing Church, which had been established in opposition to the Nazi-supporting German church during the period of the Third Reich. In discussing what the church might offer to the Jewish people beyond the preoccupation with the past, the idea emerged of the need for establishing a dialogue with the Muslim world. The idea had already been mooted by Rabbi Dr. Leo Beck, the spiritual leader of German Jewry during the Nazi period, who had survived Theresienstadt concentration camp. Already in a presidential address to the World Union for Progressive Judaism in 1949, he had spoken about the fact that Judaism and Islam were now neighbors. He wrote, "Today they are almost compelled to face each other not only in the sphere of policy, but also in the sphere of religion. And there is the great hope that they will behold each other and then meet each other on joint roads, in joint tasks, in joint confidence in the future." When Pastor Mechler moved to Berlin to the Evangelische Academy, together with Rabbi Blue, they began a series of conferences for the three so-called Abrahamic religions, and in the process created the Standing Conference of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Europe, JCM. Again, the history is developed in the thesis by Dr. Körpler. In 1967, I was in Israel studying Hebrew in preparation for entry into the Leo Baeck College to begin my rabbinic studies. The Six-Day War was the last occasion when I put my medical skills to work in Hadassah Hospital. The following year, I attended the JCM conference in Berlin. During one of the sessions, we were asked why we had decided to participate in the conference. A young Egyptian man said that his brother had been killed in the Sinai Desert during the Six-Day War. The silence that followed his remark was electric. But he went on to say that if no peace resulted, then his brother had died for nothing. So that was why he had come to this conference to meet with Jews. This was such an extraordinary reversal of every assumption I had come to expect, and a moment of personal transformation, but I found myself feeling the need to match his commitment, and this memory has sustained me over the many years of sometimes difficult interfaith work with Muslims. In the subsequent period, we decided that an important step would be to create an opportunity for the future spiritual leaders of the three faith communities to meet during their years of study, so that they could bring this personal experience of what came to be called trialogue into their subsequent work. The actual development of the annual International Jewish Christian Muslim Student Conference, again JCM for short, took many years of experimentation to develop. Again, it was hosted from the beginning by Anneliese de Bray at her center in Bendorf. Though it was easy to provide rabbinic students from Leo Baeck College and Christian theology students from the UK and Germany, the third equivalent partner hardly existed in the newly emerging Muslim communities in Europe. However, by opening the conference to community and social workers and teachers, it became possible to ensure equal participation of the three faith communities. From the beginning, however, all the planning was done by an equal number of representatives of the three faiths, so as to model the kind of shared activity, mutual trust and respect we wanted to promote. One other set of decisions was important at the outset. We were aware that these conferences took place against the background of the conflicts in the Middle East, so a conscious decision was made to restrict the themes to those directly affecting our respective communities in Europe. Topics included the impact of immigration to the West, especially the potential conflict between the generations, as children are raised in a very different environment from their parents. Issues like intermarriage, the challenge of multiculturalism to personal identity, the impact of secularism on traditional religious or a central aspect of the conference was group work with lectures restricted to 3, one from each of the 3 faiths. The speakers were invited to focus on a common problem so that we were looking together in the same direction, and we learnt about our differences as a side product of the process rather than being directly confrontational. Inevitably, the events in the Middle East had their effect in any given year, but we tried to evaluate them in terms of their impact on our European communities. Again, the presence of families with children ensures the experiencing of the human dimension in all aspects of the encounter. More than 30 years after its inception, the JCM Student Conference remains at the cutting edge of such encounters. In the past 30 years, any number of initiatives have been developed to further develop amongst the 3 Abrahamic dialogue amongst the 3 Abrahamic faiths. Some arose as a reaction to Samuel Huntington's A Clash of Civilizations, others to counteract the waves of anti-Islamic feelings triggered by 9/11. One example, the International Council of Christians and Jews introduced an Abrahamic Forum into its program. We are clearly in the middle of a major re-evaluation of the Western relationship to the Islamic world, which is itself undergoing enormous cultural and political changes with their inevitable impact on the nature and forms of the faith itself. Large Muslim diasporas in the West are having to adjust to a very different intellectual and spiritual environment, while experiencing at the same time the dangers of a growing Islamophobia and racism. In some ways, those in the Muslim European diaspora are facing similar challenges to those faced by Jews in the wake of the emancipation, a medieval religious system facing the challenges of modernity, and an immigrant community trying to find an appropriate way of conforming to the expectations of Western society while preserving their own unique identity. Both of these tasks are addressed in an unwelcoming and often hostile environment. One Jewish response was to develop a new concept of rabbinic leadership. The Talmud scholar and religious judge of the past had to acquire a more pastoral role and a set of academic qualifications to complement traditional forms of learning. In part, these changes came about from within the community itself, recognizing the need to communicate religious values to generations growing up with a Western education and increasingly alienated from the tradition. But this internal need was also a response to pressures from the governments of the time, which exercised control over the training of Christian religious authorities. Most of the great European and American rabbinic seminaries were created within a 50-year period from the middle of the 19th century. Today we are seeing the same issues affecting Muslim communities throughout Europe under the banner of promoting a, quotes, moderate Islam, close quotes, in contrast to the perceived Islamist threat. Government-sponsored programs are being promoted or introduced in the United Kingdom, France, Holland, and Germany, and probably elsewhere as well, to develop local training programs for imams, most of whom are currently imported from the home country of the immigrant community. These newcomers often have little grasp of the local language or culture, thus reinforcing the alienation of the local homeborn younger generation. Though there are many disagreements about what is meant by moderate Islam and whether this kind of program is ultimately helpful, it is also supported from within the Muslim community, as was similarly the case for the Jewish community. To return to a final aspect of my personal history, but is relevant for this paper, having graduated as a rabbi from Leobeck College, I was invited to return there to teach Bible and subsequently became principal. Throughout my time, I promoted an interfaith component into the rabbinic program. For example, it has been an important principle that any formal teaching about other faiths at the college should be done by someone within that faith rather than by a Jewish expert on the subject. So we have regularly had Christian and Muslim lecturers on our faculty. The principle is that the personal experience and commitment behind what was being taught was an essential factor. Though such a concept may not be necessary within a purely academic framework, it takes on particular significance within a religious seminary program. I have discussed the implications of this openness in my book, Talking to the Other, Jewish Interfaith Dialogue with Christians and Muslims. Here are a few conclusions I drew from the perspective of a Jewish seminary. The presence of Christian students at the college means that a discourse that in the past has been held totally within a closed group is now being observed by someone from outside. Moreover, that person belongs to a faith community that has often been the other against which we have defined our own selves. Suddenly, all the simplistic comparisons are no longer available, in part out of respect for the guest in our midst, but also because our own errors, projections, fantasies, and misinformation can be instantly corrected. In many ways, this is healthy and invigorating once you have recovered from the shock. The presence of the other and the particular qualities they display encourages us to look for the same qualities in our own tradition, elements that may simply not have been emphasized in recent times. Moreover, we obtain a different perspective on ideas and values within our own tradition that we may have taken for granted. Seen through the eyes of the other, they take on new dimensions, and we may learn to value them afresh. It is also very sanguine to learn that some of the most valued truths sound like through the ears of someone else. Sometimes their narrowness or polemic nature are exposed, which can be most disturbing. Arguments about exclusivity, uniqueness, and special emphases that we assume belong to our tradition alone may sound a little hollow when we encounter them elsewhere, even with minor variations. The commonality of many religious ideas can even be quite disconcerting when we have built up our own views in contradistinction to an imagined other. Certainly, such a situation takes the edge off the customary triumphalism that has all too often been the hallmark of our encounters in the past. The other side of this is the need to make theological space for the other, which is itself a delicate matter. For we need to create for ourselves an understanding of where we locate the other, but without falling into the old trap of creating simply a new stereotype of the other, even a more positive one, but still does less than justice to their complexity and multifaceted reality. That is to say, we have to become engaged in a process of continuing adjustment, reflection, and empirical testing, rather than settling for a tidy, closed formulation. My conclusion. In the face of overwhelming, potentially destructive forces operating in the world today, often motivated by politicized religious teachings, the individual gains in mutual understanding and trust made by interfaith dialogue seem small and insignificant. Yet as the Catholic theologian Hans Kung has formulated it in his quest for a world ethos, no peace among the nations without peace among the religions, no peace among the religions without dialogue between the religions, no dialogue between the religions without investigation of the foundations of the religions. Or as I have myself occasionally expressed it, in the past, the three monotheistic religions have defined ourselves in contrast to one another. Now we have to learn to define ourselves in relationship to one another.